Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Osterhout, the executive producer here at Lincoln Square. And today I'm joined by political scientist Minh Lee, who has a new book coming out answering to us why democracy demands accountability. Professor, thank you for joining today.
Thanks, Sam. I'm really glad to be on your show to talk about democratic accountability in my book that's coming out from Princeton.
Yeah, I'm, and I want to show the book cover here. And this is available for pre-order currently.
Yes, and it will be available in bookstores on March 10th.
March 10th. Wow, that's coming up.
Yeah, very soon.
Yeah, time is like compressed in such a weird way these days.
Yeah.
I want to. This book is so fascinating to me and so prescient, and we've had all of these conversations about democracy and what democracy is and what it means to us and what it has been historically and how the founders envisioned and all and where we're going with it. And you kind of take I think a really novel and interesting approach. You argue, that democracy shouldn't be understood as an expression of a single will of the people. And I'm going to talk about that later as well. But instead, it's ensuring equal accountability of government to the vast and huge diversity of people that it governs. In other words, it's less about just every once in a while showing up at a polling station and more about our ability to hold officials to account. So, are we a democracy?
Well, I think that we're falling short of being fully democratic right now. And the book was really animated by the concern that we're seeing the rise of elected authoritarians,
Yes.
both domestically and globally. People who were voted into office but are attacking the rule of law, undermining freedom of dissent, freedom of speech in the press, and assailing minorities. But they're claiming to be democratic because they were voted into office. They're representing the will of the people. Now, the danger there is that because they say that they represent the will of the people, that it's somehow undemocratic to oppose them. As Erdogan has said, the president of Turkey, we are the people, who are you?
Right.
So my view, instead of centering a homogenous, uniform will of the people, is really centering, as you said, the equal accountability of government to each one of us. And that's important to making us as citizens self-governing, that is the ones in charge. And what democratic accountability consists of is an authority that each of us has as a citizen over our officials. So it's really reframing government officials, not as kings or as people who are undemocratic to oppose, but really our public servants who have to answer to us.
Right, and I know some definitions of democracy, place the ability of all citizens equally to participate or to voice their will or their opinions or to so on and so forth. But this really comes at it from that standpoint of accountability. And obviously, I mean, this is really prescient right now because, Trump is patently unaccountable, right? And I think that previously it felt like he was just skirting the law. He was going to do what he wants, but really unaccountability is a feature of his presidency. Is he a pretty classic autocrat? I mean, I think media has sort of held its tongue on whether or not he's an authoritarian. And they, this often say he has authoritarian tendencies, or what's the difference?
Well, a main concern, for example, is that he's really cracking down on a lot of our democratic accountability rights. So, for example, the FCC is being used as a kind of cudgel to shut down opposition to the president. Think of the cancellation of Stephen Colbert, for example, the fact that he was not allowed to have on board a Texas Senate contender. And so that's, I think, really worrisome because one of the arguments in my book is that democratic accountability, it includes the right to vote. That's going to be very crucial, but also includes a broader array of rights and institutions. So the book really is really emphasizing the importance of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of protest. And what's really interesting is that racial justice protesters, for example, they're 3 times more likely to receive a violent police response compared to other protesters, even if they're equally peaceful, even if they're behaving in the same way. So that shows that the government is not being held equally accountable to all citizens, but the ability of some citizens to hold the government to account is being impaired because of the fact that they might be a racial minority, for example.
What does that say about our system currently?
Yeah,
It's not good.
it is problematic, but something I wanted to emphasize in the book is to provide that historical perspective that this is not a unique moment, but there have been many other instances in which democratic accountability and thus our ability to be self-governing, to be the ones in charge as citizens, has been threatened before. So, for example, John Adams, who was our second president, he passes a law called the Alien and Sedition Act in 1798, and it actually outlaws criticism of the president. And in order to hold the president to account, what happens is that James Madison and Thomas Jefferson actually formed the first opposition political party in the United States, the Democratic Republicans. So Adams only gets stopped because there's a combination of an election that intervenes and elects Thomas Jefferson, and also Democratic Republicans to the House and the Senate. But the other thing that happens is that there's a use of freedom of speech in the press to criticize Adams and to stop him with his overreach of executive power. So this is something which, although we're living in a moment right now where democratic accountability is under a lot of pressure, I want to give people hope by showing it's been under pressure before, it's been assailed before, and we work together as an American people to push back and to reclaim our right to self-government.
Well, so let me ask you that then. How does accountability? I mean, I think a lot of us maybe have a real sense of hopelessness and helplessness and alienation from the democratic process at the moment. We're watching all of these forces and influences. You know, we're taping this before the State of the Union, where Trump is expected to defend, in some cases, the indefensible and also terribly unpopular policies. What does accountability look like on the ground with the electorate? How are we meant to find our ability to hold our leaders accountable other than at the poll?
So, for example, one thing that we can do is contact our representatives.
Mm-hmm.
So it helps to really stiffen the backbone of our representatives to push back against power when they know that their constituents are really supporting what they're doing in terms of exercising oversight over the government. There's a really interesting study that came out by David Brockman at the University of California, Berkeley. It was published in the American Political Science Review, which is the top journal of political science. And it found that representatives systematically overestimate how conservative their constituents are. And it's because conservatives are much more likely to contact their representatives. And there was a follow-up study, interestingly, also in the APSR, that replicated this in an international data set. So that's true even not just the United States, but in the United Kingdom, Japan, France, etc. So one thing that citizens can do is to contact their representatives. The second thing they can do is to protest, to assemble, exercise their right of freedom of assembly under the First Amendment. And that's really crucial, as we saw recently, because it was protests that really led to a lot of the breakthroughs that we've seen in terms of the civil rights movement, such as the 1964 Civil Rights Act and 1965 Civil Rights Act. Another thing that we can do is to exercise our freedom of speech in the press. So as John Lewis, who was a major congressman and collaborator of Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement, when you see something, you should say something, you should do something. So democracy is not a state, it's an act, and every generation has to do its part. So democratic accountability crucially includes a set of democratic duties that we have, as I emphasize in my book, to hold the government accountable, to exercise oversight, the duty of oversight, to make sure the government is acting justly on our behalf, because the government is our public servant. So we have to make sure the people who are working for us are using our power justly.
So I'm wondering if you see, you know, I'm looking at the protests in Iran currently, which have turned incredibly violent and deadly, and some, you know, tens of thousands of protesters have been murdered, and yet they still are trying to practice their protest in the streets. Is this sort of authoritarian lack of accountability a slippery slope? Does it start in one place and inevitably end up in another place without resistance?
There's a kind of emulation that occurs with different countries. So if you have a rollback of democratic accountability rights in one country, other countries can subsequently might copy that. So, for example, Viktor Orban has done a lot in terms of shutting down Central European University, attacking institutions of higher education, making sure that media companies are being sold to his cronies. And there's a risk that other countries are copying that because Orban was a speaker at CPAC, for example,
Yeah.
recently. That's very worrisome. But at the same time, I think that democratic activists can also learn from one another. That's important for people to learn about how authoritarianism was successfully resisted. And really crucial to that are freedom of association, so that we're working together. Edmund Burke, who was an Anglo-Irish statesman in the late 18th century, he said something really striking. He said, when bad men combine, the good must associate, else they will fall one by one in unpitied sacrifice in a contemptible struggle. So I think what Edmund Burke was saying, and he was a conservative, is that in order to push back against authoritarianism, and he was really pushing it back against the authoritarianism of King George, we have to work together. And that's how authoritarianism was ended in Eastern Europe, for example, with the Solidarity movement in Poland, as well as the Charter 77 movement in Czechoslovakia, people associating together and being willing to speak out against autocratic power.
I wonder if the opposite then is true, that the autocrat seeks to divide because they understand that that sort of solidarity is a bulwark against their own worst impulses.
That's exactly right, Sam. I'm glad you pointed it out. And it was actually something observed by Aristotle in the Politics 2,500 years ago. He has a really fascinating part of the Politics where he talks about how different regimes like democracies and oligarchies and tyrannies can be preserved or dismantled. And in the section where he talks about how democracies fall, he points out two things. One is the concentration of excessive power in a president or a chief executive. And the second thing that happens is that the ability of people to work together is really undermined. So authoritarians will try to divide people. It's what the ancient Romans called divide and rule, divide and impera. So they try to set up people to be pitted against one another. So they're too busy with internecine fighting to hold the government accountable. And one thing Aristotle says that authoritarians typically do is attack institutions of education. Because what happens when people are learning together is that they acquire the civil skills and habits to hold the government accountable, but they also develop a sense of trust with one another, which enables them to cooperate together to oppose authoritarianism.
Sure, education is at its core a form of collaboration, right?
Absolutely.
And collaboration makes you feel collaborative and unified. I know, again, in Iran, they attacked the universities in 1980, through the early 80s. Orban has done very similar things. And I hate to say it, but education is under attack here in the United States. And I know, we talked about Orban a little bit. He's the administration's favorite autocrat right now. Does it concern you? Do you feel like they're taking a play out of his playbook, or is Trump just doing entirely his own thing?
I think that there are certainly some parallels. For example, the use of the FCC to curb expression against the president. And this is something that we've seen recurrently in American history, like with the 1798 Sedition Act by President John Adams, but also under Woodrow Wilson, he was a Democrat. In 1918, he passes the Sedition Act, and he uses it to crack down against freedom of speech and the press. And I make this argument in my book. It's called the revealed preferences argument, because a lot of times, as you said earlier, people think, oh, there's nothing much I can do. Like, what is the use of speaking out and organizing with other citizens? Well, certainly, if you look at the behavior of authoritarians like apartheid South Africa, the German regime in 1933 onwards, they take democratic accountability rights very seriously. Because if these accountability rights were really powerless, if they were toothless, then they would be pretty indifferent to the fact that citizens have them.
Right.
But actually, if you look at the history of apartheid South Africa and Nazi Germany, they were very concerted about banning the exact same rights in terms of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association. And as Frederick Douglass said back in the 1860s, he said freedom of speech is the dread of tyrants. They know its power. That's what he said in a speech in Boston at Faneuil Hall against slavery. So I think authoritarians act as if, and they have very strong incentive to keep in power, that our democratic accountability rights aren't powerless, but they actually fear them, they dread them, which gives us a hint that they're quite potent.
Well, let me ask you this possibly unanswerable question. You're welcome. What makes speech so potent, so powerful?
Well, I think it does two things. The first is to inform each other of injustices. So, for example, in 1963, there was a march on Washington that was organized by Martin Luther King. Mm-hmm. So the fact that it was publicized, that people were watching the march on television, and also that people were watching violent crackdowns on some civil rights protests, really galvanized public action in terms of passing the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which finally ends or legally curbs racial segregation in public accommodations. So I think, one thing that speech does is that it informs us of the injustices that occur. And Martin Luther King had a really interesting analysis in a letter from a Birmingham jail, where he talks about how injustices are possible because people ignore them. There's a kind of shroud of silence around these injustices that allow them to continue. So we break that shroud of injustice. We inform each other of these injustices. A second thing that happens when we deliberate together is that we realize that we're not isolated or alone in opposing abuses of power. So there was a really interesting book that came out in the 1990s by Timur Kuran. He's an economist and political scientist at Duke University. And he was trying to explain the mystery of why the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact countries, the communist regimes in Eastern Europe, fell so quickly. And he talks about how there can be a cascade. So perhaps one person would stand up, but only if one other person stands up. And there's a second person who will stand up, but only if two other people stand up. Well, if no one stands up, even if the majority of people oppose the regime, no one will speak out. But if one person speaks out, then one person who will speak out. If one other person speaks up, they will stand up, and then you have two people standing up, and then you get a cascade rolling where a lot of people all of a sudden realize that their preference to oppose the regime is very widely held. So, in other words, freedom of speech enables the public to feel its power, to know people are not alone and isolated in opposing what the regime is doing.
And there's the theme, right? Education, also collective spirit, speech, collective spirit. It really comes down to what exactly you're saying is the people have the power to hold their leaders accountable. And in that case, we have a more equitable democracy.
That's absolutely true. And I think the book really emphasizes and underscores how we have a duty to hold the government democratically accountable, because really there are public servants, they work for us. So in the book, I give an analogy of, imagine you have a group of townspeople and they hand over a gun to a sheriff, right? The townspeople have a duty to make sure that the sheriff is using the gun to enforce the law, to protect the community, and not to terrorize anyone, either citizens or non-citizens, certainly not to torture other people. And so similarly, we have this duty to make sure our public servants are using our coercive power, the power of government, in a way which is just.
When you introduce a gun in the first act, it has to go off by the third act, right? So talk a little more about the gun, because the coercive nature of government can boil down to the monopoly on violence. And how do you see that playing out in our current system? I mean, we have ICE in the streets in American cities, really making a sort of dramatic show of violence and terror and really frightening people. Their voices so far have not been silenced, but is that it seems like that would be a pretty essential tool in the toolkit of the autocrat, is an expression of violence and a willingness to use it at any cost.
Yeah, I think here my view is very different from a popular will accountability theorist. Mm-hmm. So for the popular will theorist, because the president represents the will of the people, as President Woodrow Wilson said, the president's the only official elected by the entire nation. It would seem like if there are any limitations on the power of the president, it would seem to be undemocratic because it would be a limitation on the ability of the president to carry out what the people want.
Interesting.
So that view is going to be very skeptical of the limits of office, any limitations on powers, any checks and balances. But in my view, which emphasizes equal accountability, what really jeopardizes our authority as citizens, our ability to be self-governing, or the ones in charge as citizens, is the excessive power of government.
Right.
Because then it might actually reverse the relationship where our public servants are working for us. Instead, our public servants would be tyrannizing over us, dictating to us, because we couldn't hold them accountable if we have to live in terror of, sudden knock on the door in the middle of the night. So that would actually argue in favor of limitations in power. And those limits aren't undemocratic because they're preventing the president from doing what the people want. They're democratic precisely because they preserve the relationship where the president and other public officials are working for us, and we can exercise our authority over them.
Well, I mean, it's so simple, but so mind-blowing when you really put it that way, because so much of the discussion about Trump over the past year, and in fact over the past 10 years-ish, has been the power of the executive, right? We need an unfettered executive because he was elected with he talks about the mandate all the time. But if you go back to the analogy of the sheriff in the small town, we've given this man a gun and we're expecting him to not terrorize us with it, right? And so, yeah, it makes so much sense that checks on his power are actually quite democratic.
Oh, yes, because if all power were agglomerated or assembled or consolidated in a single official, there'd be no way to hold them accountable, because they could, rig the courts, they could set the police upon like any critics. So limitations on the power of public officials in general are going to be really crucial to democratic accountability. Because the way I define accountability is that it's an authority that we have as citizens over our officials. And by authority, I mean the right to impose enforceable duties on our officials. So, for example, if an official tries to shut down a peaceful protest, or a right to vote, we can go to a court and sue the official to stop their abuse of power. But that presumes that officials are under the rule of law and they're subject to the law. So if there are decisions that give public officials impunity and prevent them from being held accountable under the law, that actually works against accountability and is undemocratic.
And it seems pretty clear on its face that that's true. And in fact, I think another discussion that has been happening publicly is Trump's willingness to abide by rulings in court against him, and it still remains to be seen if he will go along with some decisions. And also, it remains to be seen who is there as a backstop to his unchecked power. And I love this idea that, in fact, we are. And we say in our chats all the time, call your representatives, make your voices heard. And it feels, it can feel like a very nominal, weak thing to do when you have no other options. However, what you're saying is it's actually quite powerful.
It is actually quite powerful. And what's interesting is oftentimes with my students, there's this initial view, this sense of resignation. And there was a great book on the first populist movement written by a historian named Lawrence Goodwin. And what Goodwin talks about, he looks at the question of why, when things are awful, why don't things ever change? Why don't people rise up more often when they're subject to abuses? And one of the major reasons is a sense of resignation, a sense that there's nothing that we can do about it. But really, what's incomplete about the resigned point of view or stance is that it can't explain why dramatic social changes have happened. So why is it that supermajorities of Americans were opposed to same-sex marriage in the 1990s, but actually supermajorities of Americans are now supportive? It's because of deliberation. People talk to neighbors and friends who turned out to be LGBTQ, and they became more supportive of it. So social change can happen. Or think about the rights of women. Before the 1960s, women largely could not go to law school or medical school or even college. But that changed because of social activism, because of protest, people going out and associating together and working for change. So if we look at the advances in justice that we've inherited and benefited from, such as movements to allow interracial marriage, same-sex marriage, rights for women, civil rights for racial minorities, those were only possible because of the exercise of these democratic accountability rights. So we shouldn't be hopeless now, because that kind of stance of hopelessness can explain how we were able to make progress against injustice in the past.
Right. We talk a lot about the attempts to unwind that progress as well, which, rolling back, gay marriage, for example, would feel like progress to a certain set of American. Obviously, it is regression, not progress. So I'm wondering what gives you the most hope right now?
I think what gives me the most hope is that Americans are increasingly feeling a sense of solidarity towards one another. So, for example, in Minnesota, what was interesting is it wasn't just Hispanic citizens who were on the streets protesting; it was also white citizens. And in 1963, on the March on Washington, Martin Luther King said a really revealing quote. He said, "We cannot march alone." And by that, he meant if the only people protesting are the people who are suffering injustices, it's very likely that these injustices will continue. But if we stand up, if we stand shoulder to shoulder with other people, as the mayor of New York recently said, to get to any one of them, they have to go through all of us, then it becomes much more likely that we can oppose abuses of power if we stand in solidarity with one another. So that's, I think, is what is giving me the most hope right now, that we're realizing the importance of solidarity.
Can I ask you just a personal question?
Sure.
What got you thinking about this angle on democracy? What got you involved in this whole field? What was it about democracy and accountability that you were like, I need more of this?
Yeah, I think one thing is that I was born in the United States, but my parents are refugees from Vietnam, and one grandparent was sent to a concentration camp by the communists in North Vietnam. So he was there for like a year, and his wife, my grandmother, was outside the gates of the concentration camp waiting for him, and he was finally released, and he was emaciated. He survived and eventually moved to America and became a citizen. But something very similar happened to my other grandparent, my maternal grandfather, but this time in South Vietnam with the regime that was over there. So what that led me to realize is that abuses of power can have dramatic effects on people's lives. So, and then people are able to get away with these abuses of power if we're callous and indifferent, if we don't stand in solidarity with other citizens. So that, I think, really brought out the importance of the democratic duty of solidarity in my mind. As well as the democratic duty of oversight. So the duty of oversight is to make sure to participate democratically, to make sure our public servants are not acting unjustly. And the democratic duty of solidarity is to participate democratically to protect our fellow citizens from being excluded from democracy. So I think that got my mind going when it came to conceiving of democracy in a way that doesn't involve considering that public officials should have no checks on their power.
Right. I mean, we talk a lot about democracy on Lincoln Square, and as flawed as our system has been, as inequitable as it was built to be, it's still a great hope, and it's still absolutely worth fighting for. The power of us, the power of the people here.
It really reminds me of two quotes. One is from Thomas Jefferson, and then it's so important that James Madison, his fellow framer and the main architect of our Constitution, said in Federalist 48, an elective despotism was not the government we fought for.
Right.
So, it shows like the government should not be just this elected authoritarian regime that, because it was elected, can do whatever it wants in the name of the will of the people. So an elective despotism was not the government we fought for. And the other quote I really want to emphasize is from John Adams. And he's writing late in life to Thomas Jefferson, reminiscing in the 1820s about the founding of America. And then Adams says, what was the revolution? Was it the war? No, that was just the effect and consequence of the revolution. And then John Adams says something very powerful. He says, the revolution was in the minds of the American people. And what he means by that was that the American Revolution is based on this idea of self-government, that ordinary citizens are the people in charge of their government, and our officials are public servants who work for us. And for that to be possible, we have to have the authority to hold them democratically accountable, not just in elections, but also during office, through our freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of protest, and freedom of association, and the rule of law. So I think we have to go back to the spirit of John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, and realize that these are the animating principles of our Constitution and system of government.
That's a great place to end. Professor Minh Lee, your new book is coming out March 10th, Answering to Us Why Democracy Demands Accountability. It's really an incredible read, and I think it's just so important right now. Pre-order, check it out. And Professor, good luck with the book launch. And I hope you'll come back and talk to us again soon.
I'd be very pleased to do so, Sam. Thank you so much for your very insightful and illuminating questions. It was a real pleasure to talk about the book and to hear your thoughts during this podcast.
Yeah, I got to say, going into the State of the Union, I'm not super excited about democracy right now, but this made me feel a little better. So thanks.
Oh, good. I'm glad that I could impart some hope. And I think hope is important. It's one of the major virtues because it enables us to continue working for progress.
I agree. Wonderful. Thank you. We'll see you next time.